The sun was a merciless god in the cracked, umber sky, a hammer of white-hot light that beat down upon the parched earth. Here, in the heart of a land that had forgotten the taste of rain, a woman lay like a discarded doll, her fine city dress torn and sullied, a mockery of the life she had once known. Her name was Alara, and the breath in her lungs was a thin, ragged thread, soon to be snapped by the unforgiving heat. The dust was a shroud, caking her lips and eyelashes, and the world had shrunk to a blazing, indifferent sky above and the searing ground below. She was a single, fading heartbeat in an ocean of silence, left for dead by a man whose promises had been as false as a fool's gold and whose cruelty was as vast as the plains themselves. This was the end, she thought, not in a torrent of fear, but in a quiet, desolate acceptance. The wind, a hot and whispering specter, stirred the dry brush, sounding like the final, dismissive sigh of the world. This was a story born in betrayal, a life cast away into the furnace of the frontier, a place where only the strong or the ruthless could hope to endure. But what happens when the one who is abandoned is not ruthless, but virtuous? What happens when her only weapon is a spirit that refuses to be extinguished, even when hope has turned to ash? Welcome to our story. Have you ever felt utterly alone, pushed to the very edge of your limits, wondering if a single act of kindness could change everything? This is the story of Alara and a man named Silas. It is a story about how the deepest wounds can sometimes lead us to the only person who can heal them, and how in the harshest of wildernesses, the most resilient thing that can grow is love. It is a testament to the fact that even when left for dead, a heart can still fight its way back to life, guided by the light of another's soul. We invite you to witness a journey of survival, redemption, and the quiet, unyielding power of a love that was never supposed to be. The man moved through the landscape as if he were a part of it, a crag of rock given motion, his features carved by the same wind and sun that sculpted the canyons. His name was Silas, and solitude was the armor he wore against the world. He had built his life on the far edge of nowhere, a ranch nestled in a protective crook of the hills, a fortress against the ghosts that haunted him. The loss of his family years ago in a cholera sweep had hollowed him out, leaving behind a quiet, honorable man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his grief and his work. He was scouting the southern line of his property, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanning the horizon not for trouble, but for the familiar shapes of his world. The hawk on the thermal, the ripple of heat off the rocks, the subtle track of a coyote. It was then he saw it, a stain of color against the dun canvas of the desert, something that did not belong. He approached with the caution of a man who knew that the frontier rarely offered pleasant surprises. What he found stopped him cold. It was a woman, hovering so close to death that she was more spirit than flesh. Her face, beneath the grime and sunscorch, held a refinement that spoke of another world, a world of soft hands and gentle words. His first instinct, a cold and selfish thing born of his self-imposed exile, was to turn away. She was not his problem. She was trouble, a complication he could not afford. Bringing her into his life would be like letting the wild, unpredictable world breach the walls he had so carefully constructed. But then her eyelids fluttered, a barely perceptible movement, and a sound escaped her cracked lips, a whimper so faint it was nearly stolen by the wind. In that sound, he heard the echo of a cry he could never forget, the sound of a life slipping away, and the honor that was buried deep beneath the layers of his sorrow. The core of the man he used to be stirred. He could not leave her. To do so would be to kill the last, flickering ember of his own soul. With a sigh that was a curse and a prayer, Silas knelt. He gathered the woman into his arms, her body unervingly light, and turned his horse back toward the isolated sanctuary of his home, carrying the world he had tried so desperately to shut out. Alara awoke to the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs, a scent so profoundly different from the metallic tang of dust and fear that it felt like being reborn into another existence. She was lying in a narrow bed, the sheets clean and coarse against her skin, a heavy quilt covering her. A fire crackled softly in a stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light across the rough-hewn timbers of a single-room cabin. For a moment, she thought she had died and this was some strange, rustic corner of heaven. Then the pain returned, a dull, throbbing ache in her head and the fire of a dozen cuts and scrapes across her body, reminding her that she was brutally, painfully alive. She saw him then, his back to her, standing by the fire. He was a broad, still figure, a silhouette of quiet strength against the flames. When he turned, she flinched, the memory of another man's cruelty a phantom that still clutched at her heart. But this man's eyes were not cruel. They were weary, guarded, and as gray as a storm-laden sea, but they held no malice. He held a bowl of thin broth, and he approached the bed without a word, his movements deliberate and sure. He didn't smile, didn't offer a single comforting platitude. He simply set the bowl on the small crate beside the bed. "Eat," he said, his voice a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. That was all. He then retreated to the far side of the cabin, busying himself with mending a piece of leather tack, granting her a space of silence. In the days that followed, this silence became their language. He was a ghost in his own home, a man of profound and unbreachable sorrow. He tended to her needs with a detached efficiency, changing her bandages, leaving food and water, ensuring the fire never died. He never asked her name or how she came to be at death's door in his wilderness. He seemed to want to know nothing about her, and Alara, in her fear and shame, was grateful for his lack of curiosity. She watched him, though. She saw the way his large, calloused hands could be surprisingly gentle as he stitched the leather. She watched him stare out the single window for long stretches, his gaze fixed on a horizon only he could see, his expression one of a profound and settled grief. The cabin itself became her world, a small ark of safety in a terrifying wilderness. Its sturdy walls kept the howling wind at bay, the same wind that had once felt like a harbinger of her death. Here, under the watchful, silent care of this stoic protector, the wind was just the wind, and slowly, agonizingly, the terror that had frozen her soul began to thaw, replaced by a fragile, budding curiosity about the wounded man who had saved her. The healing of Alara's body was a slow, steady process, but the healing of her trust was a far more delicate and hesitant affair. It grew in the spaces between words, in the quiet rhythms of their shared isolation. The cabin, which at first had felt like a cage, however safe, began to feel like a haven. The days settled into a routine that was as predictable and comforting as the rising and setting of the sun. In the mornings, Silas would be gone before she woke, tending to his small herd of cattle and the demands of his ranch. He would leave a pot of coffee on the hearth and a portion of oatmeal or biscuits. When he returned at midday, they would eat their meal in their customary silence, seated at the small, scarred wooden table. But the silence was changing. It was no longer the tense, wary silence of strangers, but a comfortable, companionable quiet, filled with the unspoken understanding of two people who had seen the worst of the world and survived. One afternoon, as a pale sun filtered through the window, Alara found her voice. "My name is Alara," she said, her own voice sounding foreign to her ears, fragile from disuse. Silas looked up from his plate, his gray eyes holding hers for a moment longer than usual. He simply nodded. "Silas," he replied. It was not a conversation, but it was a beginning. A few days later, she asked, "Why are you helping me?" He took a long time to answer, his gaze drifting to the fire. "No one should die alone in the dust," he said finally, and the simple, profound honor in that statement resonated deep within her. She began to help in small ways at first. She swept the floor, her movements still stiff and sore. She learned to mend his work shirts, her delicate stitches a stark contrast to his rough-hewn repairs. She would watch him from the doorway as he worked in the corral, his movements with the horses economical and yet possessed of a deep, innate understanding. He was a man in his element, a man whose hands knew how to build, to mend, to nurture. He was the antithesis of Baron Finch, the man who had brought her west with promises of marriage and a new life, only to reveal himself as a tyrant who knew only how to take, to control, and to destroy. She had been Finch's property, an educated accessory he planned to show off before casting aside. With Silas, she felt, for the first time, like a person. Underestimated, yes. Wounded, certainly, but not an object. He asked nothing of her, and in doing so, he gave her everything, the space to find herself again. The frontier outside the cabin remained a harsh and unforgiving place, a land of sharp edges and sudden violence, but inside those four walls, a quiet and resilient trust was taking root, as tenacious as the scrub brush that clung to life in the rock. The sky had been a bruised purple all afternoon, the air thick and heavy with a tension that mirrored the unspoken emotions coiling within the cabin. As dusk fell, the storm broke. It was not a gentle rain, but a frontier deluge, a violent tantrum of nature that threw sheets of water against the windows and sent the wind shrieking through the eaves like a vengeful spirit. The sound was immense, a deafening roar that seemed to shrink the world down to just the four walls of the cabin, trapping Alara and Silas in its turbulent heart. The fire in the hearth spat and hissed as stray drafts found their way down the chimney. Silas, who normally kept his distance, was forced by the storm's fury to work inside, mending a saddle blanket near the fire. The proximity was unnerving, charging the small space with an awareness that was impossible to ignore. Alara, her mending forgotten in her lap, found her eyes drawn to a small, crudely carved wooden bird that sat on the mantelpiece, its form worn smooth by time and touch. It was the only object in the cabin that seemed to hold any sentimental value, a small island of personal history in an ocean of Spartan functionality. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, she rose and picked it up. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the storm's roar. Silas stilled, his hands ceasing their work. He did not look at her, but his entire posture seemed to brace itself. "My daughter carved it," he said, his voice raw, stripped of its usual gruffness. "Her name was Lily." The name hung in the air between them, a fragile, sacred thing. The story came out of him then, not in a rush, but in broken fragments, like pieces of a shattered vessel he had kept locked away for years. He spoke of his wife, Sarah, and their 7-year-old daughter, Lily. He spoke of a happy life in a small farming community, of a home filled with laughter. And then he spoke of the sickness, the cholera that had swept through like a thief in the night, stealing his entire world in the space of a single feverish week. He had been the only one to survive, a fact he spoke of as a curse, not a blessing. He had sold the farm, unable to bear the ghosts, and had come here, to the harshest, most desolate place he could find, to build a life where there was nothing left to lose. As he spoke, Alara saw past the stoic protector to the grieving husband and father beneath. The storm outside raged, but inside the cabin, something shifted. A wall of his own making, built of grief and solitude, had just been breached. She did not offer empty condolences. Instead, she simply placed the small wooden bird back on the mantel and returned to her chair, her heart aching with a shared understanding of loss. She had lost her future. He had lost his past. In that moment of shared vulnerability, in the heart of the storm, they were no longer just a rescuer and his charge. They were two lonely souls, finding a strange and profound solace in each other's silent company. The fragile peace of their shared world was shattered by the arrival of a man who smelled of city smoke and cheap whiskey. He rode a tired-looking bay and wore a bowler hat at a jaunty angle, an absurd affectation in the stark wilderness. He introduced himself as a Pinkerton agent, a man named Hobbs, and his eyes, small and shrewd, swept over the cabin, missing nothing. He said he was looking for a woman, an absconded governess named Alara Vance, who had fled the employ of her benefactor, the esteemed Baron Alistair Finch. The Baron, he explained with a greasy smile, was merely concerned for her welfare. Silas stood in the doorway, a silent, immovable wall between the agent and the cabin's interior, where Alara was hidden, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could hear every word, and the sound of Finch's name was a physical blow, dragging her back to the terror she had fought so hard to escape. "Haven't seen anyone?" Silas said, his voice flat and cold, the rumbling undertone gone. replaced by something as hard and sharp as flint. This is a big country, easy to get lost. Hobbs was not so easily deterred. He dismounted, his gaze lingering on the cabin, on the single plume of smoke rising from the chimney, a clear sign of habitation beyond a lone man's needs. "The Baron is a powerful man," Hobbs said, his tone shifting from conversational to menacing. "He offers a generous reward for information, and he doesn't take kindly to those who obstruct his interests." In that moment, Elara saw a side of Silas she hadn't known existed. The quiet, wounded man vanished, and in his place stood the protector, a figure of cold, lethal stillness. His hand didn't move toward the gun on his hip, but his entire being became a weapon. His eyes, now the color of glacial ice, fixed on Hobbs. "I heard you the first time," Silas said, each word dropping like a stone into a deep well. "There's no one here. Now get off my land before you get lost permanently." The threat was unspoken but absolute, hanging in the air with the weight of a death sentence. There was no bluster in it, only a calm, deadly certainty. Hobbs, for all his city-bred arrogance, was not a fool. He was a predator who had just stumbled into the den of a larger, more dangerous one. He looked from Silas's face to the vast, empty landscape that stretched out in every direction, a place where a man could disappear without a trace. He licked his lips, his bravado evaporating under the cold fire of Silas's gaze. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away, casting one last, nervous glance over his shoulder. The immediate danger had passed, but the cabin no longer felt safe. The outside world, in all its cruelty and greed, had found them. The ghost of Baron Finch now stood between them, and the sanctuary Silas had built was no longer a fortress, but a target. The departure of the Pinkerton agent left a chilling silence in its wake. The air in the cabin, once thick with a comfortable quiet, was now taut with a new and terrible awareness. The sanctuary had been breached, and the specter of Baron Finch loomed over them, a promise of violence to come. For days, an unspoken dread hung between them. Silas became even more withdrawn, his patrols of the property longer, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for a threat he knew was inevitable. He was a man preparing for a siege, his movements precise, his jaw set in a grim line. He was fortifying his walls, both literal and emotional, retreating back into the solitary warrior he had been before her arrival. Elara watched him, and a profound change began to take place within her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer the paralyzing terror that had once consumed her. It was being replaced by something else, a slow-burning anger. She was not just a victim of Finch's cruelty. She was a survivor, and she had survived because of this man, this quiet, honorable man who had asked for nothing and risked everything. Now, the world she had escaped was coming to destroy his. She would not allow it. She would not be the damsel in distress who brought ruin upon her savior. The woman who had arrived at this cabin, broken and helpless, was gone. In her place was a woman who had discovered a core of inner strength she never knew she possessed. One evening, as Silas cleaned his rifle by the firelight, his face a mask of grim determination, she stood before him. "I cannot hide here forever," she said, her voice clear and steady. "This is your home. I will not be the reason it is destroyed." Silas looked up, his work forgotten. "He will not have you," he stated, as if it were an unalterable law of nature. "And I will not have him destroy you for protecting me," she countered, her chin high. "I was a governess, Silas. I taught history. I taught of tyrants and the people who stood against them. I will not cower while a man like Finch tries to burn down the only good thing that has happened to me." In her eyes, he saw not the frightened woman he had found in the desert, but a queen defending her last bastion. He saw her resilience, her virtue, her courage, and in that moment he realized the truth of his own heart. Protecting her was no longer a matter of honor. It was a matter of necessity. She had breached the walls of his grief and brought life back into his empty world. The thought of losing her, either to Finch or to a life on the run, was more terrifying than any enemy he had ever faced. His isolation was over. He had found a new purpose, a new family in this woman who stood before him, ready to face down a monster. "We will face him," Silas said, his voice imbued with a new warmth. Together. It was a pact, sealed not with a touch, but with a shared gaze of absolute resolve. They were no longer two solitary people, but a single unit, bound by circumstance and a love that was just beginning to find its voice. The day Baron Finch arrived was unnaturally still, the air holding its breath. He did not come alone. Flanked by 4 hired guns, men with dead eyes and cruel mouths, he rode up to the edge of Silas's property as if he owned it, his fine clothes and arrogant posture an ugly blight on the rugged landscape. They did not approach the cabin directly, but began a slow, deliberate circle, their intent clear, to terrorize, to intimidate, to burn. "Alara!" Finch's voice boomed across the clearing, a sound of slick, confident tyranny. "Your little game of hide-and-seek is over. Come out and I will be merciful. I will only punish the farmer who harbored you." Inside the cabin, Alara's hands trembled, but her resolve held firm. Silas stood by the window, his rifle in hand, his face a calm, focused mask. He was not a rancher anymore. He was the soldier he had once been, assessing the threat, calculating the odds. "Stay away from the window," he ordered, his voice low and commanding. "They'll try to draw us out." The first gunshot was not aimed at the cabin, but at the small barn, a warning shot that splintered the weathered wood. It was followed by a torch, arcing through the air and landing on the dry roof of the hayloft. Flames erupted, a hungry orange beast consuming years of Silas's hard work in moments. A cry of despair escaped Alara's lips. This was her fault. But Silas's hand found her shoulder, a brief, steadying touch. "It's just wood," he said, his eyes never leaving the men outside. "He can't burn what matters." The fight began in earnest. It was not a wild shootout, but a deadly chess match. Silas used his knowledge of the land, moving from the cabin to the rocks behind it, a phantom who fired with deadly precision. He was not fighting with rage, but with a cold, protective fury. He was defending his home. He was defending her. Alara, however, was not content to hide. Her mind, sharp and educated, raced. She saw one of Finch's men trying to circle around, to get a clear shot at Silas from the flank. He was using the smoke from the burning barn as cover. Thinking fast, she acted. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the hearth and, taking a deep breath, burst from the back door, running low towards the well. The gunman, distracted by her sudden appearance, turned his attention to her, a sneer on his face. It was the opening Silas needed. A single shot rang out and the man fell. Alara did not stop. She reached the well, her heart pounding, and with all her might, she upended the full bucket of water she had drawn that morning, creating a curtain of steam and mud, further obscuring the gunman's view. It was a small act, a desperate act, but it was hers. She was no longer a damsel to be rescued. She was fighting alongside him. The climactic confrontation came when Finch, enraged and impatient, charged the cabin himself, believing Silas to be pinned down. He burst through the door, his face contorted in a mask of possessive fury, his pistol raised. "She is mine," he screamed. But the cabin was empty. Silas was outside, a ghost in the rocks, and as Finch stood silhouetted in the doorway, a target in his own rage, Silas had his shot. He did not kill him. He aimed for the Baron's gun hand. The shot was perfect. The pistol clattered to the floor, and Finch screamed, clutching a shattered wrist, his tyranny broken not by death, but by a precise and final humiliation. The remaining hired guns, seeing their employer defeated and their numbers dwindling, wasted no time in fleeing into the wilderness, leaving the Baron to his pain and disgrace. Silas emerged from the rocks, his rifle held loosely at his side, his face grim but victorious. He walked past the whimpering Baron, giving him no more than a passing glance, his attention focused solely on Alara, who stood by the well, covered in soot and trembling from the adrenaline. He went to her, and without a word, he gently took the empty bucket from her hands and drew her into an embrace. It was the first time they had truly touched, and in that contact, all the unspoken words, all the shared fears and growing affections, were finally given release. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of smoke and her own unshakable courage. She was safe. They were safe. The threat was vanquished, its power revealed to be nothing more than the blustering arrogance of a cruel man. They left Baron Finch for the authorities in the nearest town to find a broken man whose wealth could not save him from the consequences of his own evil. The days that followed were quiet and filled with work. The barn was a smoldering ruin, a scar on the land, but it was a scar they would heal together. They worked side by side, clearing the debris, salvaging what they could. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. A deep, resonant peace. The silence of two people who have built a world together and defended it with their lives. An epilogue was being written not in words but in actions. Months later, spring arrived, breathing new life into the land. The hills were awash in the tender green of new grass and the vibrant colors of wildflowers. A new, sturdier barn stood where the old one had been, its fresh-cut pines scenting the air. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. A curtain, stitched by Alara's own hand, hung in the window, and a small pot of herbs grew on the sill. Silas, who had once been a man hollowed out by grief, was whole again. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet contentment. He smiled now, a slow, rare smile that was reserved only for her. Alara, the woman left for dead, had found not just survival, but a life more real and profound than any she had ever imagined. She was no longer a governess or a victim. She was a pioneer, a partner, the resilient heart of their shared world. Their love was like the landscape itself. Vast, quiet, and possessed of a strength forged in hardship. A love that needed no grand declarations, for it was present in every shared glance, every common task, every peaceful evening by the fire. And so, a story that began in the dust of betrayal ends in the fertile soil of a new beginning. We have witnessed the journey of Alara, a woman who was stripped of everything she knew and cast into the unforgiving wilderness, only to discover the one thing that could never be taken from her, her own inner strength. We have seen Silas, a man who had locked his heart in a fortress of grief, find redemption not by forgetting his past, but by building a new future. Their story teaches us a powerful lesson, does it not? It reminds us that our deepest wounds do not have to be the end of our story. Sometimes they are the very things that crack us open, allowing a new light to get in. It is a testament to the idea that true strength isn't the absence of fear, but the courage to act in spite of it. And it is a powerful affirmation that love, in its purest form, is not about possession, but about protection, partnership, and the quiet, unwavering decision to stand together against the storms of the world. Have you ever known a love that healed you? Have you ever found a family in a place you least expected it? The frontier of the human heart is the wildest territory of all, and it is in exploring its depths that we find our greatest treasures. The story of Alara and Silas is a reminder that even in the harshest of conditions, hope can take root, and love can, and will, find a way to bloom. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If their story of resilience and redemption moved you, please let us know in the comments below. Your stories and reflections are what build this community. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of inspirational love and unwavering courage. Until next time, remember that your own story is still being written, and the next chapter may hold a love more powerful than you can possibly imagine.